All cars have been revealed, so it's time for a breakdown of the top teams. Where have they improved? What upgrades should we focus on? And maybe even more important, are there some design secrets unveiled that could shock us all and maybe challenge Red Bull this year? Join us as we'll break down the biggest upgrades seen during the car reveals. Let's start at the front of the Red Bull. The front wing and end plates appear extremely similar to the 2023 version. As it's only a bolt-on component, and with a couple of days before the car runs in Bahrain and Red Bull's capacity to generate car parts at the flick of a finger, there's plenty of time to create an upgraded version. The front suspension setup is the same as previous year. The suspension image from behind reveals a configuration that is fairly similar to 2023. If anything, the lower wishbone rear leg may be a little higher, increasing the anti-dive effect significantly. These are just some of Red Bull's small changes, as the big ones happened in the middle and the back of the car. The side pod region will have surprised everyone. We can't see the details yet, but from the angles we could see it, it appears to be different than everyone imagined. For now, it's still unsure if the vertical radiator inlet is divided in two or not. In either case, the inlet duct is quite small and close to the side of the chassis, leaving plenty of area for the side pod corner undercut. The lower side impact protection structure, SIPS, demonstrates how compact everything is. The higher SIPS is most likely housed at the top of the side pod intake, but it's a significant shift in design philosophy, especially given how the inlet arrangement on last year's RB19 made sense. There's no point in what Red Bull has done here just yet, unless they know something we all don't. In a Red Bull 2023-24 comparison, we can see that the new car has a taller undercut aperture, indicating that if mass flow is what Red Bull is aiming for, it will have succeeded. The biggest concern is what happens if the radiator overflow is drawn through into that undercut region. We can see that the top of the side pod undercut is considerably deeper than before. It is currently towards the top of the chassis. It's only presumable that was Red Bull's challenge, and the radiator intake was designed to make that feasible. Last year, Red Bull's development strategy was to raise the radiator lower inlet surface. It has simply done away with it and expanded the top surface. There is also evidence to suppose that this adjustment permitted it to slightly raise the leading edge of the floor. Those are the most notable changes. There are also some changes made at the back. We already saw on the W15 rear wing that Mercedes had followed McLaren's lead last year and worked hard to disconnect the rear wing flap from the wing end plates. So at Red Bull, it's a case of whatever you can do, we can do better. The RB20 rear wing flap is what you would term truly disconnected. Red Bull has been the king of drag reduction when the DRS is on for the past few seasons. Red Bull's cars were not as efficient when it was closed because its theory has always been that you need the most useful downforce to accomplish the shortest lap time. And that downforce also helps prevent tyre degradation when Max Verstappen is blasting out in front by himself. If, for some bizarre reason, which we don't see very often, Red Bull has to put the hammer down and catch another car, it has that downforce advantage without the DRS turned on. When it catches up, it gets drag reduction thanks to the DRS, and with DRS also being utilized in qualifying, it's a no-brainer to treat the DRS as part of your car idea rather than an add-on. So if those are the big changes for Red Bull, what can we expect from Mercedes? Probably the most important change has been made to the Mercedes W15 cockpit position. Lewis Hamilton's plea for a new cockpit position garnered a lot of attention last year, but it could not be adjusted until right now. It's impossible to put an exact number on it, but we're very confident Mercedes has pushed the driver's seat backwards, perhaps by 5 to 10 centimeters. Hamilton disliked where he sat last year because he couldn't feel the rear axle grip level and consistency early enough. This lack of sensation can cause the rear end to be extremely sharp, as well as accelerate the deterioration of the rear tyres. It seems to be fixed now. So what about car-specific changes? Starting at the front, we can see that the new car's front wing is visibly distinct. The inboard end of the flap assembly is more swoopy, and Mercedes has eliminated the steps in the profiles as they travel outboard. It's also interesting comparing this early depiction of the new Mercedes front wing to some real-world photographs acquired during its Silverstone test. The detail in the image of the genuine car in the garage at Silverstone is more difficult to notice, but the treatment of the inboard end of the front wing's rearmost flap appears to be substantially different. This circular part with a slot gap to the third element should meet the 515mm distance requirement and will not be flow sensitive. It joins the fourth flap to the nose and hides the trailing edge of the third flap when viewed from above. Thus, it is believed that Mercedes is also breaking the visible when viewed from above regulation. The goal will be to direct cleaner airflow to the front of the chassis. A comparison with the W14 reveals that Mercedes achieved this leading-edge flap slot gap by making the nose shorter, which isolates the underside of the nose from the most front section of the front wing. This is a good thing since the slot gap enables more flow through to the underside of the nose, and hence the center area of the leading edge of the underfloor. Probably Mercedes' biggest change has been in the middle of the car, the side pods. This has been the most noticeable visual difference between the Mercedes and the Red Bull for the previous 2 seasons, and it would take a lot of humble pie to just replicate what Red Bull has established as the standard intake system for current ground effect rules. What Mercedes now has is on the verge of matching what Red Bull came up with, but it is not yet totally committed. For Mercedes, it's a very clever solution. The radiator duct intake and following exit have to do with delivering the necessary airflow through the radiator to match the cooling requirements of the power unit and all of its ancillaries, as well as the hydraulics and gearbox. It is not a simple challenge to do this while minimizing the detrimental impact on downforce levels and uniformity. It's easy to trick yourself and underestimate what's actually necessary, but when you get to the circuit, you'll need to break out the jigsaw and open up a few holes if you have any. When a result, it is preferable from a design standpoint to include additional cooling and then blank out when needed. Comparing the intake systems from last year and this year, we can notice a significant change in the flow that can pass through the side pod undercut. The intake still receives some airflow from the chassis side, which is not a bad thing because it is quite close to the criterion for undercut flow on the floor's outside edge. Nothing has changed yet at the side pod and floor edge. It's still early days, and the underfloor is a key component in providing the downforce levels and consistency that drivers want to be competitive, so there is doubt this is the underfloor we'll see in Bahrain. The side pod's top surface profile is likewise identical to the end-of-season version from last year. With this type of side pod, much more mass airflow is focused on the side exit vanes to help scavenge as much airflow from that front corner of the underfloor, allowing the diffuser to work on the airflow closer to the center line of the car. The rear suspension is one of the most significant improvements. We saw what we thought was the most recent Mercedes system on the Aston Martin, which uses the Mercedes gearbox and rear suspension as part of its customer deal. And in comparison shots of last year's Mercedes versus the 2024 version confirm it has gone to a pushrod system and built in a lot of anti-lift to the top wishbone forward leg, inner mounting rear suspension, geometry. The back leg is in a similar posture as previous year. The front leg of the lower wishbone is very high up. You want to maximize the angle between this lower wishbone and the pushrod. Otherwise, the loads in both components will be extremely high. As you can see, the placement of these components allows for just a very shallow angle. The pushrod and the lower wishbone putative junction do not appear to meet, implying that something different is driving it. It may just be attached to the upright, but that shallow angle serves a purpose other than being the simplest way to accomplish it. Then, moving on to the last car of today's video, the Ferrari. We're skipping the front as the bigger changes are made further back, starting with the Ferrari side pods. Here we can see Ferrari has included a Red Bull style radiator intake. We can see that the top surface has been shifted rearward, but the intake is nowhere like as large as what Red Bull had last year, or what Aston Martin and RB have this year. Ferrari has kept it at a high percentage of the front aperture, which might indicate that the engine requires more cooling, or that Ferrari just lacks the same degree of cooling technology as other teams. In terms of the undercut below the radiator intake, Ferrari has blended it considerably more than before, which aids in scavenging airflow from beneath that front corner of the floor. Ferrari's 2022 and 2023 models were noticeably more bulbous in this location, driving airflow outwards over the floor edge. Most other teams we've seen in 2024 have taken that bulbous style, while Ferrari appears to have gone in the opposite direction. Inside the body surface, all teams must house cooling systems, so it may be as easy as deciding how to do so, and this becomes a primary body surface need. But, given the emphasis on airflow structure surrounding the car, there is doubt any team would make that kind of packaging concession. The floor edge detail is quite comparable to last year, and there are no dramatic or aggressive characteristics that would set it apart. It has exit vanes on the front corner and a longitudinal edge vane with a slot gap, although this is all rather mild in comparison to Red Bull's previous approach. An overhead picture shows the top body surface's inboard gully, which directs radiator airflow leakage away from the primary airflow structure and other downforce-producing systems. Then we move on further back to a view Ferrari would love to show everyone during the season, its rear-end view. Here, the regulations limit the number of lower beam wing components to 2 within a certain box area. When these regulations first went into effect, most teams, except Red Bull surprisingly, went with a simple 2-element wing, but since then, the development direction has been to have a small forward upper element as a mass flow turning vane, and then an aggressive lower element that works hand in hand with the diffuser. Working together, this combination may be quite effective in both producing downforce and reducing underfloor sensitivity. Moreover, while the DRS is open, it induces an aerodynamic stall on that area of the beam wing and diffuser, resulting in a greater drag reduction and higher top speed. One of Ferrari's major issues last year was straight-line speed. It's always tough to estimate a car's efficiency based on the rear wing because it varies every circuit, but we can draw certain assumptions based on the wing design philosophy and the fact that, aside from Monaco, that theory should be applicable over the whole spectrum of wings. This wing on the 2024 car has less downforce than the wing on the 2023 car, but the treatment where the rear flap links the end plates will result in a more efficient package. McLaren debuted this concept mid-season last year, and most teams have experimented with it. It's not a magic bullet, but unless you require the most downforce possible, like you do in Monaco, this procedure will minimize drag. The 2024 car's rear wing flap trailing edge lacks a gurney flap. This could be wishful thinking, as the gurney flap here is really useful in terms of braking stability. So, these are some of the most promising upgrades from the top teams. But there are still some questions unanswered. Will they bring any further upgrades to pre-season testing? Or perhaps be bold and bring a big one to the first race? What are your thoughts? And who are you most excited to see hit the track? Let us know in the comments down below.